Good morning. It's Friday, and John Shepherd McKenzie here. Our text for today is from Deuteronomy 17, a job description for the king. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, "Let us set a king over us, like all the nations around us," be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. Well, it's pretty good as job descriptions go, obviously. The thing that interests me here is the notion of the king as one who implements the will of God as articulated in the law of God. It was, of course, easy to see the connection. Israel was God's chosen people. Israel's king, or Messiah, as they called it, would be the one who would implement God's will among the people and make sure that God's will is done. It's a little bit more tenuous in a secular society, but I don't think it's untenable. The fact is that if we don't do God's will, we'll end up doing the will of whatever party is in power. If I don't seek to implement God's will in my family, well, I'll have a family that's at war against itself most of the time. You've seen that. If we don't implement God's will in our community, then we are forced to come up with ways of trying to triangulate our neighbors, or worse than that, using brute force to get our neighbors to do what we think they ought to do. And of course, if we don't implement God's will in our nation, then there are some apt biblical phrases. Each did according to the thoughts of his heart. Each did what was right in his own eyes. They did not follow the law of God. And we are certainly headed there. Now, of course, there are those who would argue, well, you can't take a Jewish or Christian tradition and force it on secular people. And of course, the question then becomes, well, why should secular people get to decide that we can't implement a Jewish or Christian tradition? If you don't have the law of God in the hearts and minds of the people, then you'd better come up with a very sophisticated plan B, or you're going to have a society that has completely fallen apart. Lawlessness in the streets, well, we've seen a bit of that. One party gets power and they do what they think ought to be done without reference to the other party until the other party gets power. That's no way forward. Limping about with two opinions, as the prophets of Baal were described. For those who claim, well, if you put those 10 commandments or the law of God on the courthouse wall, then we're being oppressed. Or if you teach the 10 commandments to kids in a school, then those kids are being oppressed. That, of course, is complete nonsense. The law of God was always God's gift to his people. It helps them to order their society. It helps them to order their lives. It helps them to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with their God. It helps them to promote shalom, that Jewish word for peace, which means so much more than peace. It means wholeness. It means a community at peace with itself. It means enough wealth and prosperity that we can feed ourselves and have enough to share with our neighbors. We don't have to blind ourselves. We don't have to deafen ourselves. And we don't have to go on and on about the rights of those who claim they are oppressed. The law of God is not a bad way to live in ancient times, in our own times. Have a great weekend. God bless.